go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the monthly meeting of the Network on Life Course Health Dynamics and Disparities. We've got a lot of folks joining today from the network and other folks who are guests of the network. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Caras-Montes from Syracuse University. I'm one of 4 PIs who direct the network, including Jennifer Alshire from USC, Sarah Brigard from University of Michigan, and Bob Hummer from UNC Chapel Hill. So before I introduce today's speaker, I want to make 2 announcements. The first is to please mark your calendars for our next network meeting, which is Friday, April 2nd. And that meeting will hear from this past year's pilot recipients on what they have uncovered so far in their pilot research. My second announcement is that we've added a methodology workshop to our spring lineup. So the workshop will cover weighted index regression models for estimating neighborhood contextual effects. It'll be given by David Wheeler, who's in the Department of Biostatistics at Virginia Commonwealth University. So David and his team, they've been developing statistical methods that can handle high dimensional contextual databases. So specifically databases that have a large number of contextual variables collected repeatedly over time. So these methods we think will be of interest to many of us who study the health effects of geographic context over the life course. So again, so that's coming up in April. Registration or the more information is on the network website, and we'll be sending registration information soon. Okay, so with that, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Scott Burris. Scott is a professor of law and public health at Temple University, where he directs the Center for Public Health Law Research and the Policy Surveillance Program. His work focuses on how law influences public health and how we can make laws and law enforcement practices healthier in their effects. He's the author of over 200 books, book chapters, articles, and reports on issues such as urban health, HIV/AIDS, research ethics, and the health effects of criminal law. He's won many accolades for his scholarly work. I'll just mention one here. In 2014, he received the American Public Health Association's Lifetime Achievement Award in Public Health Law. So I met Scott several years ago at a small conference in Phoenix, and it was one of those game changer moments for me in terms of understanding the importance of legal factors as a key determinant of health. And we've stayed in touch ever since that conference. And in fact, Scott now serves on the advisory board of this network. So we have roped him into to our world. So as you'll see today, he's been on the forefront of a relatively new and exciting area called legal epidemiology. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Scott. Scott will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for an interactive Q&A.
Everybody see the slides? Okay, well, I am very happy to be here to talk about this afternoon. A sunny afternoon in Philadelphia, and I hope nice where all of you are. This was actually a pretty big year for law in health. People talked about it quite a bit because of this little virus, and there was a huge amount of legal action. The primary mode of control before we get this vaccine was legal. So, you know, in March, when it was just winding up a year ago, there were a few places starting to do things like gathering bans or stay-at-home orders or travel restrictions. But really a month later, almost everybody had done, you know, nearly all of these things. You know, every state had done this. You know, the way things have gone, the quixotic way they have gone this year, a couple months later, it would all started to go away again. And then this has been lathered, rinsed, and repeated ever since, down to today, when a bunch of states are cutting back on their restrictions based on rather misguided optimism or something about what's going to happen. So suddenly everybody was interested in what the law was doing, what its effects were on public health. Very basic questions if we have a lockdown, what will be the effect on health? How long will it take for the curve to start to decline? How do we do it? We clearly had social problems, questions of the meaning of legal requirements like mask wearing and so on. And then, of course, huge questions of side effects. So all these were, I'm not saying these questions were answered, but they at least were on people's mind to some degree. And even deeper questions have been coming out. So we know that we have disparities and inequities in the level and distribution of COVID and its harms. We know that the health infrastructure has not necessarily had the capacity to respond or responded well. And one of our natural questions is, well, yeah, okay, that's the sort of proximate outcome. What are the deeper reasons why somehow this country has had such a dramatic set of failures when it comes to dealing with COVID? That includes trying to think about how law fits in. Both how law in some way acts as a mediator of these underlying social conditions to produce these strange distributions or outcomes, and how law itself is shaping those distributions, an ever more pertinent and pressing question for all of us who care about the future of the country and population health. So that's great. We love it. A lot of higher level of attention to law, but I think it's not actually a new interest or a new question, and certainly not a new matter that we should be taking seriously. So in this webinar, I'll talk about why we looked at that kind of situation and that kind of problem of legal activity and decided that one of the things we should do was develop a field called legal epidemiology and how that fits into what we call the transdisciplinary model of public health law. Then I'll present some of the basic conceptual models that we use to define what the field is and does, point to some examples of important work that's been done in the last few years within this approach, and then finally jump to the question of that one of the primary questions where we've actually done something new in legal epidemiology, and that's talk about measuring law and the practice of policy surveillance. So let me start with just why we did all this. On the one hand, everybody knows, I think, no one will really dispute that law has a powerful influence on health. This is a slide that lots of people in my field use to make this point. When CDC listed the 10 great public health achievements of the last century, nearly all of them, probably all of them, had some more or less important legal component, starting with childhood vaccination laws or school vaccination laws. Motor vehicle safety is almost entirely one form of law or another, and so on down the list. So we can look at public health practice and see right away that we wouldn't be doing the kind of public health we're doing or having the kind of effects we're having in many of these areas without law as a chief mode of action. But that itself is a little bit misleading because law isn't just an intervention tool. So certainly there is what we call interventional public health law, and that is things like your safety belt laws or your clean indoor air law. That's where we're using law as the actual intervention. It's just like saying, well, we're going to have an education program. Okay, well, that would be an intervention. Well, here we have a law. It's an intervention. We can measure it as such. We can see its discrete effects on the particular health behavior or outcome that we're concerned about. But there's also infrastructural public health law, which is the law that actually creates the powers, duties, jurisdictions of health departments and creates the rules of the game for public health. And although this has been studied to some degree in public health systems and services research, there's still a lot we don't know about optimal design and nature of powers, as we saw during COVID. We, to a considerable degree, that we have ongoing policy battles over who should be able to declare an emergency for how long, what sort of things should be included within that power, and so on. And all of those will ultimately, I think, be properly treated or should be treated as questions of institutional design and governance that can be studied. Pharma regulation, of course, another one like that. But maybe the most important area, and the one that I'll point to research on later, is what we call incidental public health law and incidental public health law research. And that's all the rest of the law. That's all the law that wasn't written with health in mind, doesn't mention health, and yet has powerful epidemiologically observable influence on the level and distribution of health. So taxes. Do you want to know why we have the highest level of inequality that we've had in this country since, the 20s or before? Well, tax law is a big part of the explanation, shaping the very structure of society. Another part of that explanation is the drastic changes in employment law, which have been associated with a significant decline in the share of the workforce that's unionized, which in turn has other kinds of political and economic and individual effects. So that law is the law. Incidental law is what we're interested in if we are serious about both understanding and addressing the social determinants of health, the upstream drivers of national health. Now, we know that law has these kinds of effects, interventionally at least, because we've actually had very good science over the last 40 or 50 years that has studied that, and especially in the key, most funded areas of tobacco control, road safety, and alcohol control. That's why we know about the effect of excise taxes and drunk driving laws and clean indoor air law, because people can and do excellent science to show that. And yet, in spite of all that stuff, and the recognition that law is a great tool of intervention because how fast it can spread, because if we have a good idea that has a positive effect, it can be adopted, and often is adopted rapidly across all 50 states. These are just adoption curves of various laws. And they look like very steep, epidemic curves, like HIV breaking out among drug users in a city. Everybody gets it pretty quickly. In spite of what we may believe about legislatures not doing anything. But in spite of all that, public health, basic education in public health law remains rudimentary. It may even be harmful. I won't go into some of my pet peeves in this call. I'm going to keep it light, keep it positive. But it's not required by their accreditation body in public health education that either undergraduates or master's students actually have a true public health law course, let alone any requirement that people going into health professions, public health professions, public health practice, get any training in, for example, regulatory design or enforcement, things that they may well be working on if they are working as sanitarians or health leaders. We have a lot of failed solutions that block the agenda of change for decades. Fair Housing Act is a great example. It was passed more than 50 years ago with the mission of eliminating racial segregation in housing. 50 years later and 0 studies later, it's pretty clear that if you just look at patterns of residential segregation, it seems highly unlikely that the law had any great effect. It didn't work. And that's also true, of course, of things like building codes and other things in our major cities that somehow seem to involve a lot of effort, but not much lead abatement. We also, because we don't study the effects of laws, allow laws to persist that actually are not just ineffective, but harmful. And this is a wonderful modeling study came out a couple of years ago. And what it's depicting here is the overall effect on mortality of a range of interventions designed to reduce opioid overdose. And this was interesting because it shows in this model anyway, that prescription drug monitoring programs and drug rescheduling, both sort of very popular methods of controlling access to opioids, which on their own, on single topic studies, are shown to reduce prescription of opioids, don't reduce death. They may, in fact, substantially increase mortality. I mean, the theory here, I think, is that they drive that although you can cut off access to legal opioids, you can't cut off access to illegal opioids, and illegal opioids are a lot more dangerous. But the point is that when we looked at them in single topic studies, we say, oh, that's great, we're winning the battle. But if you sort of try and think about the overall effect of the law, you see that they're actually potentially causing more harm than good they're doing. And you only know that if you do the research. If you just pass the law and hope for the best, this just goes on and on and on, and year after year. So the problem that we faced in thinking across large swaths of the public health landscape, leaving aside tobacco and alcohol and road safety, is that we were largely groping in the dark. Law was not developed, implemented, or evaluated with the kind of strategic or systematic approach that would be possible with more evidence. So typically, and even today, this is true, we don't know whether a new law is working or how it's working, even if it seems to be working, whether it has side effects. We don't even know where it's been adopted typically, so who's being treated. And all you need is one analogy to see the absurdity of this. If we recognize that drugs are treatments, that laws are treatments like pharmaceuticals, then the idea that we would be in a world in which your guess is as good as mine as to what that pill is doing to the millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people who are being exposed, well, that just shouldn't be. Now, there's sort of obvious reasons, materialistic reasons here. We tried to figure out how much research NIH had funded over a 30-some year period on questions of the effects of law. And we found, in the most recent period, 247 grants out of 218,000 extramural grants. And that was with a generous definition of what might be legal research. And most of that was kind of in the cancer institutes, in NIAAA, it was drugs and alcohol and cigarettes. So that's pretty astonishing, but explains a lot. But I think, when we looked at, we're talking about the impetus for a field called legal epidemiology, we realized that when we looked at this problem, that was just a symptom. NIH funding in some ways is just a symptom, that there were more cultural reasons why law was so neglected. One was the sort of ick factor. The more you go in towards classical health research, the more you run into people who just don't like the law, and they therefore choose to avoid it. There's the kind of belief that law is just way too complicated. You can't possibly consider any kind of legal variables in your analysis because you just wouldn't understand it or be able to capture it and so on. And lawyers to some degree help perpetuate that belief. And then there's just the sort of, it's not my job. I paint lines. I don't move sticks. I just don't do law. And the question was, how could we start to change those kinds of cultural attitudes so that we might get to the point where NIH was putting more money into law and legal evaluation, and we might get to that wonderful nirvana where we actually know fairly quickly what laws are working and which aren't. Well, looking inward, we realized that when we in public, and I had been doing this for 30 years, as a person practicing public health, I treated it like something that lawyers do. And I thought, and upon reflection, I realized I was often guilty of mystifying it and sort of taking the position that, if you were going to do some legal research, you needed me to explain to you what you were going to do and why it was important. We saw the scientific tradition of public health that I've already mentioned, that work in road safety and alcohol and so on, as equally important to the work of law and public health, and therefore a more important part of the story to emphasize. We started to think in terms of observing what actually happens with law, to the extent that anything happens with the law in the research world. And we realized that people were actually studying effects of the unexpected effects of law. Law is a social determinant. People were studying what happens, the effects of interventional and infrastructural health laws. And there were actually also good models of policy tracking, keeping track of where the law was in place and working to help disseminate it and support evaluation. So we said, we need to give this field, equal billing. We started out with our advantage of the reason we were doing this, besides the general impetus, was the impetus of money. RWJF gave me $20 million to start a program whose mission was to increase the quality and frequency of research on the effects of law and health. And we had 7 years of grant making and also 7 years of an opportunity to think about how we might promote the field. And you got to start by naming it and defining it. And we called it public health law research. And we defined it as the scientific study and deployment of law and legal practices as factors in population health. The fundamental idea was that there was nothing new here. That, as I started with, legal evaluation law is a phenomenon made up of institutions and behaviors and people and resources, however you want to think about it, from whatever tradition you're in. And it has influence through material processes, through psychosocial processes, economic processes. And we can think and study about those kinds of inputs and processes just as we would any other kind of science. So the book here, which will soon come out with a new name, Legal Epidemiology, Theory and Methods, is an effort to, on the one hand, share the tricks of the trade with experienced researchers, people who already know how to do research. Here's how you can sort of think about doing legal research on legal factors, and also to sort of explain the, in I hope, accessible terms, how research works and how theory works for people who are going to be the non-analytic, non-design participants or consumers of the research, people like me, in other words, the lawyers. CDC folks who are also trying to spread the gospel of the importance of doing more law, they came up with the legal epidemiology moniker and developed competency models and all sorts of other great resources that people can get access to by Googling legal epidemiology. And we decided we'll use that name too. That it seemed to be catchy at CDC. A few epidemiologists objected early on, but it seems to have prevailed. And ultimately, that gives us this sort of what we call the transdisciplinary model. The idea that if we're thinking about law and public health, we definitely need lawyers. Lawyers know a lot of important stuff, and particularly when we get to translation of research, lawyers are really important. But there is a whole and distinct and valuable side that's pretty much science and public health practice, where people are actually doing law. And our goal has been that lawyers are a little more aware, appreciative of, and engaged in research and evaluation, but that health people are more willing to own, as part of their competencies, as part of their work, the legal topics and functions that we have shown, and I think it's clear that they actually do have and opportunities in their work. And I mean, I just like to, because I use that word transdisciplinarity, like to say what I mean, and because I think it's a part of what we should be thinking about all science these days. Transdisciplinarity is the sort of end of the line of all these ways of thinking about mixing across fields. And the thing that characterizes it is that we're just kind of freely borrowing each other's tools and methods and theories, and it isn't, it isn't just one discipline sort of main show. So it's trying to increase the degree to which we understand that we are all scholars or researchers, that we may draw upon different methods and tools, but we're not taking refuge behind disciplinary walls to avoid unpleasant questions or difficult limits on our own theoretical gaze. So what do I mean? Let me give you a few models of what we're thinking about in public health law research. On the one hand, it's a very simple picture. This is what we're interested in. I'm not that interested in lawmaking and the production of law. almost always when I was a funder and when I'm a practitioner, I'm unconvinced that usually yields important actionable information. But the study of how laws happen is part of it. Then, of course, we're interested in, well, how do those laws become legal practices? And how do those legal practices lead to changes in environments, changes in behavior, reciprocally interacting there until we find out some outcome in population health. The model is simple. The view of law is a little bit more complicated, a little bit broader. And I'll decipher this slide for you to show you how. First of all, we can imagine that line in the middle of the arrow is doing double work. On the one hand, it is capturing the long ago lesson of implementation research, which is that once you pass a law, it goes through a transformation process, going through its implementation through various mechanisms like policies and SOPs and training and so on into the lived experience of the frontline officers enforcing it, and ultimately to the knowledge and attitudes and beliefs of targets. And by the time it's gone through all those filters, what the law looks like on the streets and what it does may be quite different from what was intended by the people who wrote the law, or even what seems to be written on the face of the law. So there's a policy transformation process, and all that element of law is interest to us. But that line also separates public and private, or maybe links public and private, because organizations also work through law-like rules, which we can study in exactly the same way and from the same theoretical perspectives as we can law in the public sector. So we cover almost everything that's written down as in something like a rule as part of legal epidemiology. Now, we also take a pretty broad view of how law actually affects health. So, in a standard social epi picture of law and health, and I mean, I could have drawn this like the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, or any of those famous diagrams. You have whatever your social conditions are on one side, and they work through various kinds of experiences or processes in society, behaviors, and to ultimately produce health across the life course. Well, law fits in here quite nicely. On the one hand, as I've already suggested, talking about tax and labor law, law is actually shaping the social determinants of health. It is shaping the distribution of resources necessary for health, including money, including social status, including material things like housing and education, access to the amenities of life. So law is helping us create that starting point at any given moment in time. But also law is acting as a pathway, or as a mediator of pathways, that's shaping, that's carrying people from their social status through a transformation process to their health outcome. So, drug use has some immediate physiological effects, but a huge number of its health effects come as the direct result of legal intervention, like putting people in jail and what that does to people over time. And even drug use itself, the behavior is mediated in some ways by law. For example, law may make it more difficult to get a sterile syringe to inject, or may make it more difficult to get naloxone or something like that. So in every one of these areas, we see law operating in important ways to take people from their social status to their social position to their health outcome. So let me give some examples of the important work that people thinking this way about health are doing. And I stress that, we did the field building because we thought the work was important. And the field building is, has characteristics of spin to it. Fields are just such, but I think for really important reasons, and the reason that it's important is that the work really matters. So this is what we call a mapping paper by Kelly Comroe's team at Emory, writing up some data that we helped develop with them at my center. We captured 40 years of change in state earned income tax credit policies over the 50 states. That's a lot of cells, I can tell you. It's a lot of change. And what it amounts to, and for this data set, is the amount of money and the rules that are, the rules and the money that people would get back for in an earned income tax credit situation. So that itself is a lot of work. And I'll talk a little bit more about legal data creation in a minute. But what that allows you to do is another paper by that team that we also helped on, is looking at the effect of increasing the minimum wage at the state level on infant mortality and birth weight as a health outcome. Now, obviously, this is one of the great markers of social health, low birth weight and infant mortality, one of the hardest to move through any kind of intervention. And again, this is a massive quasi-experimental longitudinal study looking at 31 years times 50 states, and finding a significant effect on low birth weight and postnatal mortality from raising the minimum wage. That's really important information in this ongoing battle right now about what the minimum wage is going to be. And it's possible because of not only the improvement in analytic methods, which you guys will know about more than I, but also the improvement in data in legal measurement. And then, not to make anybody embarrassed here, but one of my favorite papers of the year and one of my favorite lines of work, Jennifer's work on state policies and life expectancy. Now, I want to spend time just digging into the measurement of the policies here, because it's using methods that we don't use to produce kinds of scales, as it were, that we haven't used, but it's quite interesting. But what could be this? I mean, let's face it. It's the orientation towards social policy that ultimately characterizes and distinguishes the states. Because no one policy makes a huge difference. But if you start to see that an approach to policy tells us why some places are more like Sweden and some places in America are more like Russia, that disposition of the political system, of the governing system, that's just, it's just hugely relevant and important. It is the big kind of question that we don't have time not to answer. And which is possible by taking law seriously, as this paper does so well. So I think by now maybe you will have figured out that we played a little bit of a trick building this field from a truly scientific point of view. That is to say, we said, well, actually, we're not a new field at all. We're just you. All the stuff you've done all along, your differences and double differences and triple differences and quasi-experimental longitudinal studies and all those things that you do, you can do that with law. Law is just another thing that can be studied, and it works. To do that, you get great science and good results. So we weren't actually breaking a lot of scientific new ground. But I think in the one area in which we have added some new stuff, some new tools and approaches, is in the realm of creating legal data, of mapping the law across time and space, and trying to enhance that as a recognized element of research and research practice, what we call policy surveillance. So scientific legal mapping is not rocket science, right? It's basically trying to be systematic and transparent. And use an acknowledged, designated, explained method of quality control. So this may not look particularly strange, since it's merely systematic and transparent. But for a lawyer, this was a real revelation, because lawyers treat legal research as a proprietary secret. And the whole idea of a lawyer's legal research is mine's better than yours. And I'm not going to tell you how I got what I got, because it's an advantage for me to get stuff that you don't get. So turning around and thinking about, well, actually, no, we're going to tell everybody exactly what steps we do and make it possible for people to reproduce them is not something that was new to a lawyer. But I think one of the things that we brought as lawyers to the process that doesn't necessarily play out in, well, maybe I'll show that in the next slide, because there are ways in which I think we brought something to this. So this is the real paradigm shift in what we're doing, which was that we would turn the words of law into numbers. And you can see, on this slide that, this is a longitudinal data set. So, every row, represents the state of the law during a particular period in a particular place. So if Colorado made some change in its law in 2013, then we're going to now have a new row. Conventionally, if you went to websites, and even today, I warn you, if you go to websites that track the law, what they will give you is the law today. You will have a hard time finding what it was yesterday or a week before, or how long it was. And of course, linking law to time and building longitudinally is crucial for any kind of causal inference research. So a lot of our work has had to do with trying to be more directive and explicit about how you date laws. And because effective date is sometimes good, there's also implementation dates that sometimes matter on certain kinds of things. And even sometimes enactment dates matter, which may be different from effective dates, depending on your theory of the effect of the law. For example, if you imagine there's lots of press to a law against driving with cell phones, and the day it's enacted, that's when the press hits. Well, that's when people might get a signal that they should not talk on their cell phones while they're driving. By the time the law comes into effect 6 months later, they may have forgotten all about it. So the effective date will have no impact, especially in the absence of enforcement. But that's all kind of the tech, that kind of thinking and attention to detail that was an important part of this work. But the other thing is the attention to the elements of the law. This is a data set of syringe exchange related law. And the fact is, two laws that authorize the syringe exchange are not the same from state to state, may not authorize the same thing, may not, be likely to have the same kind of effect or reach. And yet you'll never find a shortage of studies that look and just have a 1 and a 0 in one column. Is there a syringe exchange law or is there not? And that's really usually producing bad science, because we're misclassifying two different things as one thing. So a lot of attention to the detail and the methods for capturing that detail at a high degree of reliability. We took that scientific mapping idea and took it one step further with the idea of policy surveillance, which we defined as the ongoing systematic collection and analysis of laws of public health significance. Now, again, you see that kind of spin element of field building working here, because we're using health terms to describe legal research and to tie the idea of observing the law on a regular basis to the idea of observing disease and other matters, phenomena of health significance on a regular basis. If something is of enduring importance, ongoing importance, you keep watching it. You don't just go out every now and then and see how's cancer this year. But policy surveillance has, I think, a lot of strength as an improvement in thinking about how we do any kind of research involving the law. For one thing, it's highly efficient, or is designed to be highly efficient. So we're doing multiple things with policy surveillance. We're creating the data that is necessary for legal evaluation. So that's a huge use. But this is also a translation tool. Because if we take, and I'll show you in a bit, once you have data in the form of 1s and 0s, you essentially have digitizable information. And so you can send that wherever data needs to go, including to apps and websites and anything, publications. I mean, we can mass produce algorithmically little publications, keeping track of the law for people, because it's all 1s and 0s. So it's supporting the spread of information and innovation. It's also doing something I think really important for advocacy and for people in our field who care about commitments to change. it's actually a way to, it becomes the longitudinal observation of law and change in law becomes a way to document whether legal advice is being taken, whether legal promises are being kept, so that, we can hold politicians to account if they don't do things that are healthy. And then finally, this has been the slowest piece, but I think it's slowly happening. This is creating better access to legal information has helped us build the capacity of the non-legal public health workforce. We're still exploring ways to do that. So for you as researchers, the best news is the fairly large amount and growing amount of open source legal data, and what we hope is becoming an ethic of open source legal data creation and sharing. So the granddaddy of all these sites is APIS, which was part of the NIH funded and still is NIH funded research infrastructure for alcohol studies. And they have, more than 20 different legal topics that they cover, and they've now covered for 20 years. That's a huge trove of data. They've jumped into cannabis as well, and continue to be funded and they've even done something with COVID. So and they do great work. Our site, which was originally NIDA funded, but NIDA is not like NIAAA, it won't keep funding this. So we're using all sorts of other mechanisms to keep this alive. The Prescription Drug Abuse Policy System, which has also all the cannabis stuff. You can compare the two data sets from APIS and PDAPS, and lots of other laws. We're constantly adding. We're now doing a bunch of things in the NIDA J-Coin study to keep track of ways in which law might be shaping prescription drug abuse. Our home site, our generic site, Law Atlas, where we put everything we can that we make and that other people make and want to share. Just take one of our, we do have right now we're displaying the current earned income tax credit laws at the state level, and people can go to our site and interact with the data. There's, every variable is a question that they can check off or not, and they can find out which states have which elements that we've coded. And they can also, as you see down in the corner here, you researchers, here's where you can just click and download the data and the code book and the protocol that explains how that data was created. But maybe my favorite part of all this is the translation capacity. And this is a site that we've worked on, funded by the de Beaumont Foundation and Kaiser Permanente, that was meant to promote the adoption of 9 specific health policies in the 40 largest US cities. So it has its own website and talks about these policies, but here's how it works. It's a naming and ranking and spanking, naming, shaming, however you want to think about it, intervention with a relatively small secretariat that has nonetheless had some pretty powerful effects. So the idea is we collected the laws in each of these areas. We worked with the National Public Health Expert Body to create criteria based on the specific characteristics of the law. So not just do you have a earned sick leave law, but just exactly how many people does it cover? What are the benefits that it provides, and so on, so that we could not just say you have a law, but do you have the best version of the law, which could then be expressed in the form of you don't get any medal at all, you get a bronze medal, silver medal, gold medal, and to check all this with city leaders so that they're aware and participating. So we ended up with a picture something like this, 40 cities, a distribution of medals, including a lot of no medals when this started. And I can just give an example how this would work. I'm an advocate. I walk into my city council person's office in Philly, and I say, I'm really concerned we only have a silver in this ranking system. And I've been looking at the different policies that we have, and earned sick leave. I looked at that one, and what this website tells me is that we're almost gold. We have an earned sick leave law. We let sick leave be applied to care for a family member. We let it be applied for domestic violence recovery. The problem is we only allow 40 hours of accrual in a year, and the gold standard is 48 hours. And we don't cover all companies. We're somewhere in the 20 range, 20 employees, we need to cover every company down to 1 employee. Now that's nice. Think about it. I can, for all 40 of these cities and all 9 of these policies, I can walk in and just that easily say exactly what change I want my representative to make in order to bring up the score. And that is made possible by detailed coding of law and its conversion into digital information that can be pumped out into these kinds of visualizations. And the effectiveness has been, I think, pretty impressive. I mean, I've been doing advocacy for 30 years, and this is the easiest set of wins I've ever seen, at any level. They've gone in 2017, fewer than half the cities had any kind of medal at all. I mean, they didn't rise up to an overall medal at all. They were just too weak. In 3 years, we've come to the point where 90% of the cities have at least, they have an overall medal ranking. And every year, cities, at least a quarter of the cities or more have moved up in medal ranking. And that doesn't even reflect, that means many more medals were being earned, but they earned enough improvement to not only get medals, but to move up in their overall standing. So that's pretty great from an advocacy point of view. If my last hope for this is people start taking some of these data we now have 4 years of and do some of the research to show the effects that these policy changes are actually having on the health outcomes in these cities. Because winning legislative battles, as I said at the beginning, is fine, but if they don't actually change health, they're not fine enough. I just want to say a few things about things we're working on now, in case some of you might be interested. One is something that we have just done for WHO, which I gave the title to. I love this title. The ideal method, we call it. Identifying data for the empirical assessment of law. And what it is responsive to is the lack of research on law, right? There's so many areas in which we are using law as a potential intervention, or law is part of the scenery, but we have no evidence at all about whether it's working. This happens to be true of abortion on a global level. There are some abortion laws, particularly in the US, that have been pretty well studied, but for a wide range of abortion law, there's just not that much evidence. So we try, so as WHO Abortion Department was working up its latest set of guidelines, and that includes a literature review of all sorts of clinical and other factors, they were wondering if it was possible to have something that looked like a literature review for legal factors. So in other words, rather than doing a normative assessment of the law against human rights principles, they actually wanted to consider the extent to which it was possible to say anything robust or even tentative from empirical research about the actual effects of laws measured against health outcomes. And I depict a causal model there because that's what we did. We said, well, actually, maybe it's possible using existing research theory and causal models to identify research that actually does tell us about law, even though it doesn't purport to or wasn't trying to. So for example, probably the best example is we don't have a lot of evidence of the effect of abortion requirements of all kinds on the time it takes to get an abortion. So delay in abortion is a possible effect of law. There's a little study of that, not a whole lot. But there's a pretty solid evidence base about the effects of delay on health. Basically with every week of delay, or every week that goes by in the gestation period, the clinical outcomes get worse. So there's a measurable consequence of delay. What our method was meant to do is to say, well, if we can identify studies that show that laws cause delay, or if we can even just identify laws that by their terms deliberately create a delay, and we sort of put those together in a picture, we can say, well, actually, it's not crazy to say, well, if this law works that requires you to wait a week between encounters before you get your abortion, well, it's not crazy to say if that works, then that law would be having the health effect we know arises if you delay an abortion a week. So that's one thing we're playing with. And I think that's broadly applicable to at least make people, to help identify research gaps and also maybe take advantage of some knowledge that is quite relevant to law. The other thing we're quite interested in carrying on our open science, open source legal data cause is developing collaborative platforms where people can share legal and other kinds of data in research groups. We had some funding from NIDA and again have some funding from NIH to work on a basic platform we call the HOPE platform, Health Outcomes and Policy Evaluation. And this is meant to be it's meant to be sort of a GitHub for dummies, I guess you'd say. That is to say, a place that has a much nicer and more friendly user interface where people can actually share their data and do things with it in collaboration, because we, are built on the idea that we've got to get different fields and different researchers and different bodies of data together more rapidly to get better knowledge of how law is working. So that's where we are. That's what we're doing. There's some resources here on the page. We've got my basic websites, phlr.org and lawatlas.org. If you're interested in lectures on actual research design and analysis in legal epidemiology, CDC's Public Health Law Academy has some 2 or 3 hours worth of that, especially for your students, that you might be interested in sharing. And now I am happy to turn this over to question time.
Great, thank you, Scott. That was so interesting, and I think everybody on the call understands why, when we met a few years ago, I said it was like a game changer in terms of how I approach my work. It's just thinking about the law and the way that you do and the way that it shapes health, often unintentionally, is just so potentially powerful and something that the field has not done well enough, I don't think. So let's open it up for questions. So you can raise your hand in the participant box or just put in the chat box that you have a question, and then we will unmute and ask it. So we have our first question coming in from Claire Pendergrast. Claire, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I'm happy to. I loved that talk, and I love all the resources on the Temple website too for policy surveillance. I'm wondering what you think about budgetary practices as kind of a form of law, and about something like state plans on aging, which every state has, but they're more administrative and they direct agency activities in a less pure law format.
Well, we kind of cheat on things like taxes and appropriations because they result from law and they exist in some formal legal form. Now, the mechanism of effect, presumably, is money does something. So if the real question in all those is it useful? Is the measurement of the actual law a useful proxy for measuring the bank book? And on things like excise taxes, for example, we're in a place where you have a pretty strong collection mechanism and stuff. Yeah, you just measure the law. You don't need to earn income tax credits. We don't have any reason to, I shouldn't say it. There's some administrative problems with people actually filing for it and getting it, but it works pretty well, the law. Mm-hmm. So it's really, I think, a practical question.
So something like how much money is spent on home delivered meals in all the different states and how different those are. Could you operationalize that the same way as like the cigarette?
Well, I think what you run into eventually is that the statute doesn't really tell you how much money is spent. And so there's no shortcut there. You're going to have to somehow find, other measures of what's actually spent. Okay. And that's crucial because it's the spending that makes the difference. When we talk about law versus policy, one of the things I try and get across people is we have to think of law, in fact, policy generally, it's a mechanism for scaling up a desirable practice. Mm-hmm. If you're just studying the practice, you're not studying policy, you're not studying law. It might have relevance, But the policy question is, if we make it a law, do we get more of those meals delivered?
Yeah.
Do we get more money? So, that's useful thinking that too, because if what we're interested in how many meals get delivered, then that's what we should look at.
Mhm.
Now, the way you might do that as a policy or legal question is there a relationship across states in the nature of the enactment, the nature of the law or the existence of the law and the number of meals delivered?
Right.
And so that's another way to think about that. The question of what was your second question? I just lost it for a second.
And plans that are administered in less of a kind of dichotomous, is there a law or not, but more how an agency behaves.
So where we ground this idea of policy, legal research or legal epidemiology and policy surveillance is in a written text. That's and the value of that, and it's important anytime we believe that a written document, a set of rules, a set of instructions, a set of guidelines is going to be significantly related to some set of practices and outcomes that we care about. So it doesn't really matter if it's a text passed by a legislature versus a text handed down by an administrator. If it's authoritative in the context in which it's to operate, then we'll treat it as sufficiently law-like to study. And then the advantage is that it's the starting point for a lot of other kinds of thinking and research. We want to know what the administrator said was going to happen or should happen. We don't assume that it will, but we want to start with that. And that then also then defines a set of implementation questions, because it tells us what we should initially look at to see if that's really happening, and so on down the road. And then we become interested, as we do that research in whether there's anything about that text that may be enhancing or messing up the implementation or the effectiveness, because that text is something we can fix, we can change. So it becomes operationally important in the cycle of learning that we're really engaged in here. We're just, we do, I'm just trying to think, well, one of the things that we're just talking about doing now is a study on just to start to map hospital charity care policies. So those exist as PDFs on hospital websites.
Right.
That's what they are. But they're defining when and under what circumstances and through what mechanisms poor people can get, get a price break on their hospitalization. So we consider that perfectly fair game.
Perfect. Okay, that's good. I have a lot of PDFs.
And for that, that's where also one of the things that we're kind of interested in for Law Atlas and the Monocle at our research software is whether we have got some kind of built in and easy to use scraper for things like this, because it's really hard to find that stuff one at a time, but it's pretty easy to find it if you have a decent search algorithm and scraper.
Right. Cool. Thank you so much.
So Scott, I have a question about how to get started. I think we're all pretty excited about what you presented and can imagine how it could be useful in our work. So I'm wondering, so here's a hypothetical. Let's say I want to start a new project where I bring in state level laws related to older adults, but I don't know where to start. I don't know what these laws are. I don't know how to operationalize them. So would this be an opportunity for me to reach out to your group, ask for somebody to get involved in an NIH grant so that we could create this resource? How does that work?
Well, the easiest part is that if you have reached that plateau in your thinking where the law you're interested in, and you've thought about, what outcomes and events you're going to be measuring in relation to that law, we do quite commonly get in on NIH proposals as the people who are going to create that data. And we can also help people who want to do it themselves. And we actually, our platform for creating that kind of data, the Monocle, is free and open to anybody who wants to use it. And we're happy to train people to use it and assist. And we're delighted to have more and more people creating data for their studies and then posting it on Law Atlas as well as a way of sharing it. But that's the easy part. I think the harder part you allude to is how do you get an idea of where law might be important and why it might matter. And, there's a couple of routes to that, neither of which is always straightforward. One is you just know, somehow the law is right in front of you. Like you are actually, you have come to the point where you're really interested in, is there any relationship between charity care policies in hospitals and what they actually do with people who come in? So you kind of got that worked out and you want to. But, oftentimes I think it's a little bit more complicated, which is trying to figure out whether you can sort of find the law in your theorized causal picture of a phenomenon that you're interested in. And that's sometimes where we can be of most help, or where having people who think about law but may not be scientists can be very helpful, because if you start to describe a process that's going on in the world, the lawyer will say, well, have you thought about the fact that just there, at that point before the person gets the benefit, there's actually something that has to happen in the law, and you kind of get this, shared, you have a richer picture of the phenomenon. And so I think that's where this sort of transdisciplinary model and the inclusion of lawyers can be helpful.
That's great. That's helpful, because I think that you've worked with Kelly Comroe and her group quite a bit on these kinds of issues and, operationalizing EITC laws, for example, like you showed us today. So related to that, I seem to remember the last time that we talked a couple of years ago, your group was offering, do you have a summer institute where people who are, thinking about getting interested in this area could participate and learn more?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, phlr.org, and sign up for the newsletter, and then you'll get all the word of this. It wasn't a summer institute last year. It ended up being an October virtual institute, and I think it's going to be a virtual institute again this year, a couple of days of intensive Zooming. But someday it will once again come to Philadelphia in the summer and do this. So yes, we will. That's a training for policy surveillance, and typically has a introductory overview and an advanced. We also have all that training available on demand on the web, in recorded webinars, and we have a regular webinar cycle, so you can sign up for webinars on this. All of that's available at lawatlas.org in the learning section. And we're continuing to work on that. I think we're aiming to launch a non-matriculating certificate in legal epidemiology that will be offered at Temple, hopefully by the end of this year. And from there on, also working with other institutions that are interested in kind of creating this content.
Great, thanks. Scott Landis has a question.
Scott, thank you for your talk. I've got a question about real-time tracking of policies, legal policies, especially during COVID. And let me give you just a little bit of context. We're working, trying to understand the reasons for the increased COVID-19 death rate in group homes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so I've got a student who's been working with me that we have carefully gone through state websites for every developmental disability state entity to download all the PDFs of every policy they've been putting in place as emergency orders during COVID, PPE, temperature checks, whether you had to discharge someone. That's the big one in New York State, this whole thing with the nursing home and group homes that these homes had to take people COVID positive discharge back in the home. My concern in doing this is I just feel like in some ways, methodologically, we're just trying to grab from everywhere to see what we can find. There's just no way across 50 states in DC to come up with some standard of where we find these policies and ensuring that we actually have everything that was laid out during this time. And I just didn't know if you have any suggestions or resources that we could think about of how do we try to grapple with this methodologically in a way to make sure that we're actually getting everything.
Well, we did that for 6 months, starting in February. We tracked every COVID, major. Not on every domain. I don't think that we actually captured anything group home specific, but we were doing that thing, going to the websites, grabbing the PDFs, checking how they changed. There were over in the 50 states in 6 months. There was something like 4,000 laws that we or 4,000 instances of legal action that we captured in that. And we have that's on the Law Atlas website. There's a COVID data set, and it has a protocol which might be interesting for you to look at, because you'll be able to see in detail, how we tried to deal with exactly the problems you're talking about. And at the end of 6 months, we just gave up. I mean, we ran out of money. No one was really funding this. We just couldn't justify it anymore. I think it's incredibly important to do this. That's why policy surveillance is so important. And if we had centralized, properly, resourced authorities that could do this, we were not using any AI. So this was all human being like you, and AI would certainly have helped. There's a group at Oxford at the public policy school that we're going to talk to next week about how they did it, because they did global, and I think they did a lot. They had they had like 40 people on their white paper explaining how they had a massive staff. So I don't know how they did it. Maybe they also just did it by brute force, but with more brutes. But we're really interested to see how they do it. I think in the long run, all this is really going to become quite a bit simpler with AI, and I think that's going to happen. And we're all just part of the last generation before that really kicks in. You ask a deeper epistemological question, which is, how do you avoid, false negatives? How do you know you've found them all? And I think you don't know. But again, this is a partly, if you're a lawyer, that's a terrible thing. I missed a law. If you're a scientist, there's always, you get what you get by the methods that you use. You've explained your methods. Could those methods miss something? Maybe. When we are using somewhat more verifiable, well, I mean, you could even do this. Like we have a statistical quality control method that we apply at the end of our process, where we randomly select cells, and we have somebody else go and see if they can, independently find the law, and would they code it the same way. And we aim generally, in our system is designed to be 95% right. It'd be nice to be 100. You give us more money, we'll be 100. Or 99.999. We will not have any detectable mistakes, but there are going to be omissions. The other thing that I think we offer to make this a little easier is not so much methodology. I mean, methodology is one thing. You can see the protocol, you can see how it compares to what you did. But the other thing is technology. It's a lot easier to use. There's less room for clerical and other error, and a lot of advantages to using the software that we use to code, rather than Excel or something like that, or Access, because it's designed for exactly this purpose, and makes it a little easier to keep the data and organize it and build, especially building longitudinally, because these were changing. Every time Governor Cuomo had a new inspiration, I guess.
The details for that software on your website as well.
That's there. It's called the Monocle, and you can go to monocle.com and sign up. But again, we're happy. We give training in how to use it, and advice in developing data sets. And of course, we're always really interested in new use cases, and then the needs that those create for tweaks in the software.
Thank you.
Great. Carmen, you have a question.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for your presentation. It was really wonderful. My name is Carmen Gutierrez. I am a pretty recent PhD in sociology, and I'm now an assistant professor of public policy at UNC. So it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks. I had a couple questions. One was about whether it's in your research group, if there's an interest in understanding sort of the relationship between laws and how that has an effect on health. So, how laws are diffused and have spillover effects, and sort of build off of one another. So if and when one law is passed, that enables the passage of a later law to occur, and sort of the etiology of that relationship and how it corresponds to health. So that's my first question. And then the second question I had is sort of related to that, based on, again, the development of law itself, and thinking about who the lawmakers themselves are, like the body of lawmakers, and how that maybe also corresponds to health, perhaps through the law itself, or just the body of lawmakers independently. And then related to that, sort of the impact of voters and votership on health. And does that operate through laws themselves, or, you know, civic participation and engagement? So those are my questions. I hope they're relatively
All
clear.
right, let's, I keep thinking about each one as you talk, so let me see if I can work this out. I mean, I think I'm generally kind of very, very Catholic or universalist on theory. That's why I like transdisciplinarity. So, you know, to a considerable extent, the law is sitting there and like other social phenomena, and we can kind of use science to turn it around and look at it from different angles and see different pieces of it and make different kinds of connections. So, you know, and there's a lot of variety. You know, just recently, I just wrote a little commentary in AJPH about stand your ground laws. And, you know, when I look at stand your ground laws, which I was commenting on a literature review of, you know, evidence of their effects. But to me, when I think about the most interesting sort of theory that comes to mind is Gusfield's old idea of symbolic crusades, the idea that laws are passed. One of the things that laws are passed for, one of the ways that law works in society is that groups use them to claim public validation for their ideas. You know, so NRA is just, you know, NRA is a classic example of this. They just go crazy getting, you know, fighting gun control and getting gun protective laws, not because there's some risk that somebody's not going to have their gun. I mean, everybody can have any gun they want pretty much anywhere, but it's part of this crusade to validate gun ownership as an American, right? And by the same token, any good liberal public health person is going to oppose any law that the NRA is for the same reason. You know, all we want to do is defeat it because we're fighting a symbolic battle through legislation. Now, that's not true of every piece of law. There's lots of law that nobody's thinking about at all. Nobody cares. They need different stories. So, you know, one of the ideas here is we do have to approach, or not put it this way, we can approach law from so many different perspectives. We can think about its normative effects. And it's also interesting to think about normative effects over time. So if you think about seatbelt laws. When safety belts were first sort of made, there was a fight to make them standard equipment, and they were made standard equipment. And the question was, how do we get people to use safety belts? You know, the majority of people thought it was a crazy idea and a terribly unpleasant experience to lock themselves into their car. Safety belt laws worked by the threat of punishment and by some, you know, in many places, significant enforcement to get people to do it anyway. But within a fairly short period of time, it became a habit. And people would feel odd not wearing a safety belt. They would feel odd not putting their kid in a safety seat. They would think it's child abuse not to put a kid in a safety seat. They don't approve of drinking and driving at the level that they once did, you know, in the 1960s. So these are all areas where we, you know, I don't know that we think of the law as having an ongoing behavioral effect as much as having stimulated a sort of normative cascade that then sort of took over the labor. So there's just so many ways that you can think about how laws work using a variety of kinds of theories. That's sort of my answer to your first question and drove all the other questions out of my head. What was the second one?
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. My second question was about kind of related to the development of laws and how lawmakers and bodies of lawmaking decision makers might be also influential in health, as well as voter participation.
Well, I mean, I think Jennifer's study that I mentioned is actually a great example of that kind of work. Because what it's measuring by that constellation of policies is some kind of underlying set of characteristics in that legislature, in that polity. It's sort of a proxy measure for some orientation towards social good. And that, I mean, it's that orientation towards social good that's the thing we want to bottle, unfortunately. You know, it's not, you don't take a conclusion from that study that, oh, well, everybody should just pass the right set of laws. It's actually, what is it going to take to get Russia to look more like Sweden, you know, in terms of the way that it's governed. So that's really important research. I think it's been another political sort of policymaking study that I found kind of interesting along the same lines was some research that we funded from NYU when I had money. And I'm just blanking on the guy's name who did it, but he's now at UCLA. But the study was trying to see if there was a relationship between, he was trying to study policy breadth and policy depth in legislative session and in state law. So, if how likely was it essentially that if a legislature passed one law on smoking, that it would pass the sort of a full suite of various kinds of smoking restrictions? And similarly, was there any sort of sense that difference, consistent patterns in how deeply you went? I'm sorry, no, the first one was the depth was how many on that topic would you pass, and then the breadth was the breadth of topics that you addressed. And the question was, is there a tendency in legislatures to do a lot of lawmaking in health across the board, or is there a tendency to skate across the surface, or to really dig deeply and regulate comprehensively? And he did find some interesting relationships that would help you understand that in certain states you should go big, and in other states chances are you were gonna not win if you better go small. But the problem with a lot of policymaking research is that it in the classic tradition of public health or in political science, it sort of comes up with telling you that well, charismatic leaders and funders and industry partners are important. It's not very actionable unless you have in your pocket a charismatic leader or a lot of money. It's not necessarily going to help you make your change, and it's not it may be predictive, but it's not determinative. You could still win sometimes even without that. These days, the question of who's speaking, whose voice is heard, what kind of concerns are being listened to is kind of interesting. I mean, it seems like it might be actionable because people are so sensitive to that on the interpersonal level. They're so sensitive to that on a social level, and we've got such a problem with it, in our political system, just not being heard. So I think there's room there. And your third question was?
I think you covered them all. That was it. There was two. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That's great feedback. Thank you.
And we have a question from Andy.
Thanks, Scott. This is really interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, and I very well might be. It doesn't seem like you're making too much of a distinction between law and policy, that you're maybe using the terms interchangeably, or if there is a difference, there's not a huge difference. And so I'm wondering, it actually strikes me as maybe there is some sort of distinction where the work of legal scholars is more valuable versus the work of policy scholars, and that it seems like law maybe is more effective at stopping practices that are harmful. So, a speed law, right, it could be effective at stopping people from speeding and killing people. But if you're talking about maybe strengthening the ITC, the work of legal scholars will be less effective than the work of policy people. And I don't know, is there any daylight there then between the work of law and the work of policy?
Well, I'm gonna say this, and I guess it's okay. I'll say it on tape, because if I'm wrong, I want to be told how wrong I am, and I want people to explain to me why I'm so wrong, and I'm entirely open to that. But I have been kind of struggling with this now for many years. It's sort of why do we say law? Why do we say policy? And what's the difference between the two fields? Policy research, because policy analysis and research is a much more developed and older field, and much more present in a lot of faculties where I'd like law to be more present than legal epidemiology. But I think legal epidemiology is better. Now, classically, the definition of policy, and I'll just use the CDC definition, it's, all the rules and statutes and regulations and, all the stuff that we would count as law, written down things that say you should do this, this, or that, plus the settled practices of institutions. We don't include the settled practices of institutions in legal epidemiology, generally speaking, because we want to start with something that we can look at, an observable rule, a text of some kind. But also, I actually don't think the settled practices of institutions should be considered policy either. And that goes back to my statement earlier that I think really what makes policy, broadly speaking, and therefore including law, or law and policy as synonyms, what makes them distinctive, what their role in the world, is to generalize desirable practices or to limit undesirable practices. They are a mechanism for, you might say, population level influence. They're not the practice. The practice is the practice. You know, you could have people who sell insurance, sell life insurance, and you could, do a study of whether selling life insurance is makes people behave in more danger, do moral hazard studies, they behave more dangerously or not. Okay, well, that's a study of the effect of life insurance. It's not a policy study, Now, there's a lot of laws about life insurance, and there's a lot of rules on, when you can do it, and among other things, you could, there's laws that prohibit you from getting, that allow insurers to, well, let's see, there's laws that prohibit life insurance proceeds going to murderers of the insured. Well, you can do a study on whether having that kind of law reduces homicide. And you could also do a study of how often people kill people for insurance. The first one would be a policy or legal study, and the second one would just be a study of people's propensity to murder and what drives them to murder. I'm getting a little complicated here. My point being that what I'm afraid of in policy research is that too often it gets caught up in the practice and evaluating the practice, and not in the mechanism for spreading the practice. And the problem with that is we have lots of research that tells us there are good things to do and bad things to do. And that research only gets gets scaled up if something else happens. If people look at that practice and say, I'd like to do that too, which is one way, I'd like to adopt that, or if we fund people to adopt that practice, or if we make that practice, adopting that practice, a policy. So, in the end, I kind of take the position that, well, law and policy are basically the same thing. If you leave out those settled practices, you probably should leave out those settled practices. And that the important thing of both law and policy is scaling. That's what it's really a device for. And lawyers know that. I mean, people who think about law, they understand that. That's what they understand, that they are engaged in social control. I sometimes don't know what people who are sort of dyed-in-the-wool policy people think they're doing. And we in law have a mechanism, like make a rule, pass it as a, it could be an executive order, it could be a standard operating procedure. I mean, but create that, do that work. Whereas policy, it's more like, well, we've shown this works. Now, this is terribly oversimplified and unfair, but you did ask, and I am saying it so that people can correct me, because I want to have this discussion. It's just, it's really hard, to have occasions for this discussion. So maybe you want to correct me already.
No, I have nothing really to correct, other than clearly, at least now, law and policy work are being done in pretty different parts of academia. So I mean, yeah. So whether you would say that there's a lot of difference between law and policy, they're being done very differently, right?
Exactly.
I'm in a policy school and I don't know anyone in the law school. Then maybe that's, maybe I'm guilty of not being transdisciplinary enough, but it is the way it is.
Well, we should keep talking, because you'll be, because I do think we do need that bridge. I mean, there's a lot of great things that happen in policy research, and a lot of great devices and tools and analytic methods that are really, quite helpful. It's just, there is some kind of disconnect there, which I would like to understand and maybe eliminate.
Sure, I agree.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. I have this vision of sociology, like in decades ago, it integrated concepts from social epidemiology. It's I have this vision that now we're going to integrate perspectives from legal epidemiology. And I keep keep pushing this idea. But I think that, I mean, I'm certainly excited about bringing in legal factors and policy factors more explicitly. And I think everybody on this call is a bit more excited about it too after this discussion. So thank you so much for the presentation. And I mean, the analogies, I love if law were a pharmaceutical, how would we treat it? Like, that was really powerful. So thanks everybody for being here. It's great to see you. Thanks again, Scott. And we will see everybody on the April 2nd for our next network meeting.
Thanks, everybody. A lot of fun.